We've been dancing around this idea of composition in different ways in this class from the beginning. Think back to the Bruno Munari drawings I had you all do, where you had to take a random collection of dots and carve out some sort of use of space with your lines in relation to those dots. That's already doing composition, which is just, again, the way you arrange a space, the way you organize it, the way you divide it up, the way you structure it. Composition is in every image. So we want to look back at the things we've been doing. Last week we were working on collages and Photoshop work based on existing compositions to understand how they work. This week I want you all building off of that and everything else we've done in order to make your own compositions with collage. So composition, in our case, it's important to think about the way that you can create visual motifs, visual movement, relationships, dividing up the space, how you arrange it. I'd recommend thinking about balance in terms of, do you have large shapes, medium-sized shapes, and small shapes? Is there a balance of values? And that balance could be a full tonal range, or it could be a narrower value range. Is there a balance of color in terms of cool and warm, or a balance of saturations? Is there a balance in terms of just how much you fill the space with content versus leaving empty space or solid spaces without much information? And I like to always remember that value in an image always tends to use contrast but also to create rhythm and structure. So the backbone of an image to me is always the value distribution. I want to start with this image by Wright Morris just to show an image that has a very clear, purposeful arrangement of shapes. Wright Morris was not the person arranging these shapes. These are just objects out in the world. But when he chose to, point his camera and frame this picture, he's looking at internal relationships. There's a balance of tonalities here, values from light to dark. There's some geometric and shape motifs of these upright pole-looking shapes that are man-made and organic. There's diagonal lines cutting across that, echoed in these cables, but also these slats of wood hanging there. There's these echoes of rectangular shapes. So look at how all the shapes sort of relate to one another, point to one another. They interrelate to one another. Kazimir Malevich was doing this with painting in a very abstract sense. He thought that you could boil the history of painting down to just these very simple combinations of color and line. And just look at how the different pieces of the paintings interrelate or build depth certain ways. We can count the layers of shapes here, from the background to these shapes, to this shape, to that shape, to this shape, to this shape, to that shape. There's about 8 layers here. So thinking really consciously about how the parts of your image build towards a whole. I've shown you both these images before. You all worked with this image last week, potentially. Edward Hopper, this painting of the interior of a room, hotel room, and Robert Motherwell's very abstract collage. Notice here how they actually have a shockingly similar composition, the way these upright sort of blocks of rectangles are used to structure the space and anchor it. The way there's a balance of color in terms of the value range from really, really light to really dark, but also saturation points of really muted to really saturated. Different hues as well, a balance of cool and warm. There's more negative space here, like this empty space here, than there is in this picture, but it's quite similar. Toulouse-Lautrec was a French painter who in the late 19th century was among many painters who were influenced by photography. So notice how this painting, the composition is very cut off. This figure here is cut off the way you can kind of do with a camera if you move the frame around. Also, this big diagonal shape here is a thing that you can really trace to the influence of photography, because in a photograph, you just kind of, these objects are just there. And if you photograph it, these things will come into the space. So you see painters looking at the way they arrange content as having this sort of more graphic quality, where the edge of the frame plays more of a role. Going back to Edward Hopper, I'm a big fan of Hopper. I think you can always find some kind of division of space in his work that structures his paintings and has a really strong rhythmic quality that can divide up the space. You see this in the work of Richard Diebenkorn too, who started with much more realistic spaces. This is pretty abstract, but he's looking at this landscape in the Bay Area with all these hills and the way that these property lines and roads and other divisions of space create kind of a rhythm of shapes. And then he pared that down to very simple compositions that were explorations of that rhythm of geometries, but also of color. So look at how the color is pared down here to a very, very coherent palette. So color plays a strong role in composition, or the lack thereof. Looking at the work of Franz Klein here. This is very different than Richard Diebenkorn, but look at the way that these gestural strokes also divide up the composition into positive space and negative space. Look at how in his work the shapes go off the page. So it actually kind of does a similar thing as Lautrec, just doing it very graphically, very bold. A different strategy with composition would be to have a lot of negative empty space and then have a figure in the middle. This is, again, a very different use of space. It's dividing up the space a little bit with this line here, but the relationship between the figure in the middle as a central focal point and this empty space around it is very different. You see this also in the work of Picasso in this empty areas. There's some bigger shapes and a lot of smaller shapes, but they all kind of fill the area and are designed to overwhelm your senses. Pointing back to Gel Martins, so I showed you in the collage lecture, just to think about really rational, geometric, logical compositions and patterns you can use that distribute your visual experience in a different way than this or this. And then it's always good to look at photographs. I mean, I think photographers have always been on the forefront of finding new ways of visual arrangement. So look at the way, again, figures on the edge of the image frame a negative space on the inside. It's counterintuitive, but using the edge this much to create visual movement around the edges of the photograph can be quite effective, versus really strong, prominent, grounded figures in the foreground, on the bottom, black, really dark shadows, contrasting on top of a background. So there's a strong background-foreground relationship here. So I'm going to go through this. This is in the actual assignment page, but these are some rules of thumb that I see. Try creating a focal point. Make sure you have a sense of a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. Include a variety of sizes. Have small shapes, medium shapes, and large shapes. Always be mindful of the way the image reads or flows. Use repetition, proportions, and angles to create movement and a sense of connection. You can see that in last week's assignments with the Descent from the Cross paintings you were looking at and the Edward Hopper paintings. Playing with the edge, like I said in various images here. And most importantly, I say commit to something. If you want a composition that looks chaotic and overwhelming, make it really chaotic and overwhelming. Push it far. If you want it to be simple, graphic, and bold, trim away anything that you don't need. Strip it down to its barest possible elements and really commit to that.